The wind pushed against the worn-out shutters of the tiny cabin as dusk rolled over the prairie like a soft, dark blanket. Inside, Lila Mae Carter, just 19 and far too young to carry the weight she did, was sweeping the single-room floor she had already swept twice that day. There wasn't much to clean, just a wood stove, a patched rug, a narrow bed, and a table with two mismatched chairs, but she kept the place spotless. Cleanliness was the one thing she could still control in a life that had taken almost everything else. Outside, her family's once vibrant ranch lay abandoned, eaten away by debts, storms, and bad luck. After her parents' deaths the previous year, all she had left was this old cabin and the patch of land surrounding it. She raised chickens, sold eggs when she could, and survived mostly on grit, cornbread, and roots she dug behind the creek. But despite the hardship, she never let the coldness of the world harden her heart. A quiet gentleness lived in her, the kind that made even stray animals follow her around, as if they sensed an invisible warmth. That evening, she was tending to a pot of thin stew, mostly potatoes and a few herbs, when she heard the crunch of hooves on the frozen dirt path. Her whole body stiffened. No one visited her. No one even passed by unless they were lost. This land wasn't on the way to anywhere. She froze, ladle in hand, listening. A second sound followed. A child coughing. Her breath caught. She set the ladle down quietly, walked to the door, and peeked through the gap in the curtain. A horse, large, chestnut, with a travel-worn saddle, stood in the faint light. Beside it, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, held a small boy wrapped in a canvas coat. The man's hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but even through the failing light, she could see exhaustion in the slope of his shoulders. The boy clutched the man's collar with one hand and coughed again, violently. Lila hesitated only a second. She unlatched the door and stepped outside, the cold slicing through her thin dress like a blade. "Sir," she called softly, "are you in trouble?" The man looked up. His eyes were a striking shade of gray, alert yet tired. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. My boy's fever came back sudden. We've been riding since morning, trying to reach town, but the storm's rolling in fast." He shifted the child gently in his arms. "Could we stay a night, just until morning?" Lila nodded without thinking. She never ignored someone in need, no matter how little she had. "Bring him inside, please, it's warmer there." The man blinked, surprised by her quick willingness, then lowered his head in gratitude. "Thank you." Inside the cabin, the warmth from the stove wrapped around them like a soft quilt. Lila hurried to lay her spare blanket, worn but clean, over the small cot in the corner. The boy, maybe 6 or 7, whimpered as his father laid him down. His cheeks were flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. "What's his name?" Lila asked, gently pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. "Evan," the man replied. "I'm Cade Walker." Cade Walker. The name didn't ring any bells to her. Why would it? Her world was small, limited to her land, a nearest trading post, and whatever neighbors still lived within 10 miles. "You said you were riding to town?" she asked. Cade nodded as he removed his coat, revealing a well-built man in dusty clothes. Nothing fancy, nothing that hinted at wealth. "We were heading west. I heard there might be a doctor there. His fever hit out of nowhere 2 nights ago. He's been fighting it, but," his voice tightened, "I can't lose him. He's all I've got." Lila's heart softened. She knew that kind of fear. She had lived with it through her parents' sickness, through their final moments. She dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to Evan's forehead. "You won't lose him. We'll keep the fever down tonight. The storm will pass by morning, and you can ride safely." Cade watched her with a mix of hope and uncertainty, as if he wasn't used to kindness that came without strings attached. "What do I owe you for the trouble?" he asked gruffly. "Nothing," she replied immediately. A crease formed between his brows. "Ma'am, I can't accept charity." Lila smiled faintly. "And I can't charge a father trying to save his son." Silence stretched between them, a quiet, worn silence that felt oddly comforting. Cade finally nodded. "Thank you. You're very generous." She shrugged lightly. "It's just the right thing to do." As the night deepened, the storm finally broke, the wind whistling fiercely outside. Cade sat at the foot of the cot, one large hand holding his son's smaller one. Leela stirred the stew again and brought over 2 bowls, one for Cade and one left to cool for Evan in case he woke hungry. Cade took the bowl, but before eating, he watched her for a moment. "You live here alone?" "Yes." He glanced around the small cabin, taking in the patched curtains and wooden floor. "It can't be easy." "It's not," she admitted, "but it's home." Cade nodded, but there was something else in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe admiration. She kept her eyes on her bowl to avoid letting heat rise to her cheeks. They spoke quietly as the storm raged, about the land, about the harshness of the weather, about the chickens Leela kept and the roads Cade traveled. He never mentioned anything about himself beyond simple details. He didn't talk about money, property, or background. Nothing about him suggested he was a man with wealth, much less power. What she did notice was gentleness, especially in the way he cared for his son. The way he murmured soothing words when Evan stirred. The way he brushed a hand over the child's hair with an affection so deep it softened his entire expression. Hours passed. The fever began to drop little by little. "You're good with him," Lila murmured. Cade's eyes warmed. "He deserves better than me dragging him all over the plains. Or maybe he needs exactly you," she replied. "A father who doesn't give up." Cade looked at her as if she had said something he needed to hear. By midnight, Evan was sleeping peacefully. Cade, exhausted, leaned back against the wall near the stove, his hat tipped back, his eyes half closed. Lila, sitting across from him, watched him through the flickering firelight. He looked strong, but tired in ways that ran deeper than the ride. Something in his posture suggested he carried burdens she couldn't see. "You should sleep," she whispered. "Can't," he murmured, trying to straighten. "If he wakes, I'll wake you." He finally relented, letting his eyes close. Lila sat nearby, keeping watch over both father and son. Outside, the storm softened to a quiet snowfall, blanketing the land in white. And inside, something else settled, quietly. Something warm, something new. That night, she didn't know she was offering shelter to a man whose name carried weight across counties. A man who owned ranches larger than towns, herds worth small fortunes, and land that stretched farther than she could imagine. She only knew a father and a child needed help. The rest, his wealth, his influence, his status, was hidden behind the dusty clothes and weary eyes of a cowboy who looked like any other traveler passing through. But fate had already started weaving a thread between them. A thread neither of them yet knew would change everything. The morning after Cade and Evan arrived, the sun rose weakly behind a thick curtain of clouds. Snow still coated the ground outside Leela's cabin, sparkling faintly in the pale light. The storm hadn't fully passed, leaving the prairie eerily quiet, with only the distant call of crows and the occasional gust of wind breaking the silence. Leela, exhausted from her night-long vigil over Evan, woke early. She glanced at the cot. The child's chest rose and fell steadily. His fever had finally broken. Relief washed over her, warming her chilled hands. Cade stirred at the foot of the cot, rubbing his eyes, clearly still tired from the night's ordeal. He looked at Leela, who was folding the small blanket she had laid over Evan, and gave a soft, almost sheepish smile. "Thank you," he murmured again, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," she replied, tucking the blanket neatly in a corner. "You were doing your best. I just helped a little." There was a pause, long enough that the quiet creak of the cabin settling filled the room. Then Cade spoke again, his voice carrying a note of hesitation, almost embarrassed. You live all alone? Through storms like that?" Leela shook her head. "Not always. I manage. My folks, they're gone. It's just me now." She kept her tone even, though her heart ached at the words. Her cabin wasn't much, but it was the only place that felt safe. Cade leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window where the last of the snowfall was falling softly. "I can't imagine. I'd be lost without my boy. I don't know how you do it." Lila flushed slightly, unused to anyone noticing her efforts. "I just keep going," she said quietly. She shifted her eyes to the boy, who yawned and stretched under the warmth of the blanket. "Evan's doing better," she added. "He should be ready to ride soon if the storm lets up." Cade's relief was tangible. He ran a hand over his face, then looked at Leela with an odd intensity. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't opened the door last night. We'd have had nowhere safe, and the fever, well, I can't even think about it." Leela's heart softened again. She had seen too many tragedies in her short life to dismiss the gravity of his words. "You're welcome," she said simply. Breakfast that morning was humble. Leela made what remained of the potatoes and stretched the stew by adding some dried beans she had in her small pantry. Cade and Leela sat across from each other at the wooden table, and the boy ate quietly, still drowsy from the fever. Cade's manners were polite, careful, almost hesitant. He thanked her repeatedly, but there was something deeper, an unease that suggested he wasn't used to accepting help, especially from someone like her. As they ate, Leela noticed something strange. Cade's boots and clothes, though dusty and worn from travel, were of exceptional quality. The leather was thick and supple, the stitching precise, the coat perfectly fitted. His hands, though calloused from work, had a certain grace, and his watch, half hidden under his sleeve, glinted faintly in the dim morning light. These details didn't scream millionaire, but something in her gut whispered that he was not an ordinary cowboy. She dismissed the thought quickly. It didn't matter. They were guests now, and her focus was on keeping the boy comfortable and the man fed. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. What had started as a light snowfall had thickened, with strong winds bending the skeletal trees and frosting the ground in drifts. Cade looked out the window, his brow furrowed. "We're going to be stuck longer than I thought," he said quietly. Leela nodded, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "It's not far to town, but the roads are dangerous in this weather. You're welcome to stay until it clears." She hesitated a moment, then added, I know it must be inconvenient, but I can spare a room and some food." Cade looked at her, surprised by her offer. "I can't just impose." "You're not imposing," Leela interrupted firmly, meeting his gray eyes. "You and your son need shelter. That's all that matters right now." Cade gave a small, almost reluctant nod, then settled in for what would become a long morning. The snow pressed against the windows like a barrier, isolating them in a quiet cocoon. Leela tried to make conversation, asking Cade about the road, the weather, and Evan's favorite things. He responded in kind, gradually letting the guard around his heart soften. By midday, the storm had intensified. Snow piled higher, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves outside. Leela, who had spent most of her life relying on herself, noticed Cade's tension as he watched the snow through the small window pane. "You worry too much," she said softly. "The boy's safe. You've done everything you can." Cade's lips pressed into a thin line. "I can't help it. He's all I have. If anything happened, I couldn't forgive myself." Leela felt a lump in her throat. Her own past, losing her parents, losing the ranch, flashed through her mind. She placed a hand gently on his arm. "I know that feeling, but he's strong, and he has you. That counts for more than you think." He looked at her, the gray of his eyes softened by gratitude and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was trust. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was the beginning of a quiet bond between two people who had been hardened by life, yet still retained the ability to care. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Leela tended to Evan, giving him sips of water and making sure he remained warm. Cade remained at her side, occasionally stepping outside to check the condition of his horse or to clear snow from the path. It became clear that the storm would trap them together for at least another night. As evening approached, the cabin grew dark. Leela lit the small lantern she kept for emergencies, its soft glow illuminating the small room. Cade, watching the flickering light, finally spoke. "I've never met someone like you. You care so easily, so naturally. It's unusual." Leela smiled faintly, brushing crumbs from the table. Maybe it's just what anyone would do." "Not anyone," he said softly. "I've been on the road for years. I've seen people ignore suffering, turn away from trouble. You stopped. You didn't question it. You didn't ask for anything. You just helped." Her chest warmed at the words. She wanted to brush them off, to maintain her composure, but she couldn't deny the small flutter in her heart. "I've had to fight for everything I have," she admitted. "Maybe it's easier to help someone than to hurt them." Cade leaned back against the wall, the weight of the storm outside matching the heaviness in his mind. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You don't need to," she replied. But something unspoken lingered in the cabin, something that neither of them yet named. The storm outside became a backdrop to a different kind of connection, one built on trust, compassion, and the shared responsibility of protecting a child. By nightfall, Evan was asleep again, and the father and daughter, who had been strangers less than a day ago, found themselves sharing stories, quiet laughter, and glimpses of who they truly were. Cade, for all his strength and mystery, was human, frightened, tender, and grateful. Leela, for all her solitude and struggle, was brave, nurturing, and unyielding in her kindness. That night, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, warmth and quiet companionship held the space. Neither spoke of the future, nor of what life outside the snow would bring. All that mattered was the present, the protection of the boy, the safety of the night, and the unspoken bond forming between them. And somewhere deep inside, both of them knew that this storm, trapping them together, was more than just a twist of weather. It was the beginning of a story neither had expected, a thread weaving their lives together in ways neither could yet imagine. By the time the first hints of dawn began to glow through the heavy clouds, Leela felt a strange sense of certainty. She didn't know who Cade Walker truly was, or what future his arrival might bring. She only knew that, for one night, they had sheltered each other from a storm, and in doing so, had unknowingly opened a door to something that could change everything. Finally, the morning after the storm, the prairie sparkled under a pale sun that barely broke through lingering clouds. Snow had drifted high along the fences, bending the wooden posts and making the world seem distant, quiet, and untouched. Leela Mae Carter, still sleepy from the previous night's vigil, stretched as she moved about her small cabin. The fire in the stove crackled, throwing warmth across the room and casting flickering shadows on the walls. Evan was awake, sitting on the cot with a small wooden toy horse in hand, quietly playing, while Cade stood nearby, brushing snow off his coat and boots. The night had left its mark on Cade. Though outwardly composed, his movements carried a restrained tension, as if he was constantly aware of some unseen weight. Leela noticed the careful way he handled his son, and the way his eyes darted toward the cabin's doorway whenever the wind rattled the window panes. She didn't know it yet, but Cade was carrying secrets, secrets that could astonish her, change her understanding of the world, and perhaps even the fate of her lonely life. "Evan seems better," Lila said softly, carrying over a cup of weak herbal tea she had brewed. "He's got a good appetite this morning." Cade gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He does, thanks to you. I don't know how you managed that stew last night. He hardly ate anything the past 2 days." Lila laughed lightly, a sound that seemed almost foreign in the quiet, snow-blanketed world outside. "It's all about care. A little warmth, a little patience, a little persistence. You'd be surprised how much it works." Cade leaned against the doorway, watching her with something close to fascination. He said nothing, but she noticed his eyes, gray, intense, and waited with stories he wasn't ready to tell. There was something different about him, something beyond the worn coat, dusty boots, and travel-worn hat. His demeanor suggested experience and hardship, yes, but also refinement, subtle details that hinted at wealth, influence, and a life far removed from the simple plains she knew. The day stretched on. The snow showed no intention of melting, leaving roads impassable and towns unreachable. Leela found herself reluctantly offering them breakfast and lunch repeatedly, while Cade remained awkwardly gracious, insisting he should contribute, though she refused him each time. By late morning, she finally asked the question that had been tugging at her mind. "Cade, you don't strike me as a simple traveler. You've been on the road a long time, but there's something in the way you move, your hands, your boots, even the way you talk. You've seen a world far beyond these plains, haven't you?" Cade froze, as if caught off guard, the words hanging between them. He finally spoke after a pause, carefully measured. "I suppose I've had my share of experience. Let's leave it at that." Leela sensed he wasn't lying outright. He was just not telling the truth either. She chose not to press further. Some things revealed themselves in their own time, she reminded herself. But curiosity sparked within her. She observed him, the meticulous care with which he handled Evan, the silent attention to the cabin, and even the subtle way he inspected her stove and cupboards without seeming to. He was a man unaccustomed to such modesty, yet he carried himself as if he belonged anywhere he went. Hours passed, and the storm's remnants outside showed no mercy. Snowdrifts blocked the door, and wind howled across the prairie like a living thing. Leela and Cade found themselves confined together, sharing meals, repairing a section of the broken floor, and even splitting chores to keep the cabin habitable. Small details revealed more of Cade's character. He was intelligent, patient, and resourceful. He fixed the stove's flue temporarily, carried firewood without complaint, and helped Leela reinforce the door against the cold gusts. Through these shared tasks, Leela began to see layers of him. He wasn't just a wandering cowboy as she had assumed. He carried himself with confidence that came not from bravado, but from authority. There was something about the way he considered the efficiency of the cabin, the security of his son, and the preparation of meals. It was practical, yes, but precise. Too precise for a man surviving on the road. Late that afternoon, after Evan had napped and the cabin fell silent, Cade approached Leela while she repaired a crack in the floorboard. He seemed hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Leela, I should tell you something. You probably wouldn't understand. Or maybe you would, but it's not simple." She looked up at him, curiosity and caution mingling in her expression. "Try me." Cade exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I'm not just a traveling cowboy. My family, we own property, businesses, wealth, I guess you could say. I don't usually travel alone. I don't usually reveal anything. But I needed to keep Evan safe, and I didn't want anyone to treat him differently, especially in a storm like this." Leela blinked, caught off guard. She had suspected something, but hearing it spoken aloud shifted everything. The man she had welcomed into her home, the one she had seen as another weary traveler needing shelter, was not just wealthy. He was important, influential, capable of commanding attention and resources she couldn't imagine. For a moment, she felt a pang of insecurity, a flicker of fear that he might look down on her modest cabin, her simple meals, her humble life. But Cade, sensing her reaction, quickly added, "But I didn't come here for wealth or status. I came here because my son was sick and I needed shelter. That's all. Nothing more. I didn't plan to impress you, and I certainly didn't plan for this connection to form." Leela studied him, seeing sincerity etched in every line of his face, in the quiet weight of his voice. She realized he wasn't boasting or flaunting his position. He was sharing a truth that mattered because it affected her perception of him, not to elevate himself. The revelation shifted something between them. The cabin, which had been a space of survival, warmth, and quiet companionship, now held a different kind of tension. They were no longer just two people trapped by a storm. They were two people discovering hidden truths about each other, realizing that first impressions often masked deeper realities. Cade, seeing her contemplative expression, smiled faintly, a mixture of apology and hope. "I hope this doesn't change anything between us. I don't want it to." Leela shook her head slowly. "It doesn't. Not really. You came here in need, and I helped. That's what mattered. The rest is just details." For the first time that day, Cade relaxed visibly. He sank into the chair beside her, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They spoke quietly after that, about Evan's favorite games, about the coming spring, and even about Leela's small garden behind the cabin. There was no awkwardness, no need for pretense, just honesty, however delayed it had come. As the afternoon faded into evening, the storm outside finally began to relent. Snow still blanketed the world, but the harsh gusts softened to whispers, and the sky hinted at clearing. Cade stood by the window, Evan asleep in his arms again, and Leela beside him, watching the quiet prairie. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that secrets, even when revealed, did not have to divide. They could strengthen bonds, clarify intentions, and deepen trust. Cade's wealth, his hidden life, his status, none of it changed the fact that last night and the day that followed had forged a connection built on compassion, resilience, and shared humanity. By nightfall, as lanterns flickered and the fire burned low, Leela realized that her world had subtly shifted. She hadn't expected anything to change, from offering shelter to strangers. Yet, in revealing a hidden truth, Cade had unknowingly invited her into a story far larger than the snowbound cabin, one that promised challenges, discoveries, and perhaps even love. And as she watched him, holding Evan carefully, she understood that the threads of fate had begun weaving themselves together, threads that neither wealth nor status could sever, threads that had started simply because a young girl opened her door to strangers one stormy night. The snow had finally begun to melt in patches by late afternoon, revealing the frozen brown grass beneath. The storm had passed, but the wind still carried a sharp bite across the prairie. Cade and Evan had spent much of the day inside the small cabin, playing quietly, while Leela moved about, keeping the fire stoked and the cabin warm. By now, the initial tension of strangers meeting had faded. What remained was a subtle, growing understanding, a bond built on shared struggle, compassion, and a quiet acknowledgement of trust. Cade had taken to helping Leela with her daily chores. He chopped wood for the stove, repaired a leaky roof patch, and even helped clean the small corral where a few chickens scratched for food. Leela watched him, noting the efficiency and care in his movements. There was something different about him, an ease with responsibility, a natural leadership, and a keen intelligence that seemed to guide every decision. He was more than a father trying to protect his child. He was a man with the capacity to care, to think, and to act decisively, even in unfamiliar situations. Evan, meanwhile, had recovered fully from his fever. His cheeks were rosy, his energy returning in playful bursts. He clung to Cade, laughing and running around the cabin, his small boots scuffing the floorboards. Leela found herself smiling more freely than she had in months. The warmth of the fire and the presence of her unexpected guests easing the loneliness that had become a constant in her life. By late afternoon, Cade found himself sitting across from Leela at the small table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fire and Evan's occasional laughter in the background. Cade studied her quietly, sensing the resilience behind her calm demeanor, the strength in the way she moved and spoke. She had survived hardship, yet her heart remained open, capable of compassion even in the face of struggle. "You've handled everything remarkably well," Cade said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "I don't know that I could have done as much if I were in your place." Leela shook her head, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "It hasn't been easy, but you do what you must. You make the best of what you have." Her voice was soft, yet carried an unspoken strength. Cade's eyes lingered on her for a moment, and for the first time since their arrival, he allowed himself to fully consider the implications of the day. He had arrived seeking shelter and found it, yes. But he had also found something unexpected, a human connection, rare and genuine, that made the long, lonely road he traveled feel less isolating. The conversation shifted naturally, moving from the practical to the personal. Lila spoke of her parents, of the ranch she had once helped manage, and the challenges she faced in keeping her small cabin and land viable. Cade shared stories of Evan's childhood, the places they had traveled, and the struggles he had faced raising a child alone. They laughed quietly at minor misadventures and mishaps, their shared laughter filling the small cabin with warmth. As evening fell, the light dimmed, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Cade noticed the small details, the care with which Lila had maintained the cabin, the simple elegance of her routines, the way she treated Evan as though he were her own. He realized that in a world often governed by wealth and status, he had encountered someone whose values were rooted in kindness, courage, and a quiet sense of responsibility. Dinner that evening was simple, a stew stretched with potatoes and beans, served with fresh bread. Cade and Lila ate together, Evan between them, his small hands reaching for spoonfuls with delight. Cade watched Lila serve the meal, noting the grace and efficiency with which she worked. She had lived a life of hardship, yet she moved through it with dignity and composure. He found himself increasingly drawn to her, not by appearance alone, but by the depth of her character, the warmth of her spirit, and the strength she displayed in the smallest gestures. After dinner, the three of them gathered around the fire. Cade held Evan on his lap, the boy's head resting against his father's chest, eyes heavy with sleep. Lila sat nearby, mending a tear in one of Evan's shirts, her movements precise and careful. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the soft determination in her features. Cade felt a strange sense of peace in the room, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "You're very good with him," Lila said softly, glancing up from her sewing. "He's lucky to have you." Cade's voice was quiet, reflective. "I don't know if I'm good enough, but I try. That's all I can do." Lila smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can do. Try their best. Sometimes that's enough to make all the difference." The quiet companionship of the evening deepened their understanding of one another. Cade began to see Lila not just as a kind stranger who had offered shelter, but as someone remarkable, a young woman whose strength and resilience had shaped the home she had built from the remnants of her past. Lila, in turn, saw Cade as more than a weary traveler or a desperate father. She saw a man capable of deep care, humility, and quiet heroism, someone who had chosen to protect his son above all else and had not hesitated to trust her when he had no reason to do so. As the fire burned low and Evan's breathing grew steady in sleep, Cade spoke again, this time with a hint of vulnerability. "I've met people who would have judged me for what I do, for the life I live, for the way I've raised my son. But you treat us as equals. I don't think I've ever met anyone like that." Lila's eyes softened. "We all have struggles, Cade. Some are visible, some are hidden. But kindness is something we can choose to give, even when the world seems harsh. That's all I did." He nodded, feeling a warmth that had little to do with the fire. The honesty in her words, the simplicity of her perspective, and the grace with which she moved through life left a profound impression on him. He realized that his visit, meant only as a temporary shelter from a storm, had grown into something far more meaningful, a connection that neither of them could ignore. The night deepened, and the cabin grew quiet. Cade sat in the chair, gazing at the sleeping child in his arms, then at Leela across the fire. He understood that their time together, forced by circumstance and necessity, had created bonds that were unlikely to be broken. The storm outside had passed, but the warmth they had shared, the trust they had built, and the understanding they had reached would remain, shaping the days to come. By the time the first hints of dawn began to glow through the window, Cade and Leela had spoken of little else but the simple joys and challenges of life. They had discovered common ground, a mutual respect, and a shared commitment to Evan's well-being. In that quiet prairie cabin, the seeds of a deeper relationship had been planted, one born not of wealth or convenience, but of compassion, resilience, and an unexpected night of connection. And though neither spoke of the future, both knew that their lives had changed in ways they could not yet fully understand. Cade's presence, once temporary, had become a thread woven into the fabric of Leela's daily life. Lila's kindness, once a simple act, had touched Cade more profoundly than he could have anticipated. Outside, the prairie awaited them, cold and expansive, but inside the cabin, a quiet warmth lingered, one that promised hope, trust, and the beginning of a story neither had expected, yet both were now eager to see unfold. The morning sun glimmered weakly over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow across the prairie. The storm that had trapped Cade, Evan, and Lila for 2 nights had passed completely, leaving a world of sparkling frost and crisp air. The snow had melted in some areas, exposing the brown, frost-kissed earth beneath, while other patches remained stubbornly white, reminding them of the challenges they had endured together. Inside the small cabin, the warmth from the stove filled the space, carrying the comforting scent of breakfast cooking, cornmeal pancakes with a few of Leela's precious eggs, a simple meal for 3 that now felt extraordinary in its quiet intimacy. Leela moved with practiced care, flipping pancakes and stirring syrup into a small pot, her movements steady, calm, yet infused with a subtle grace that Cade couldn't help but notice. Evan sat at the table, impatiently tapping a spoon against his plate, his cheeks still flushed from yesterday's fever. Cade leaned against the doorway, watching the two with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since his travels began, he felt a sense of stability, a rare, precious thing. His son, his heart, was healthy again, laughing freely, and he was discovering that the young woman who had opened her cabin to them carried a spirit and strength he admired beyond measure. "You're making a big breakfast," Cade said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that matched the fire. Leela glanced up and smiled faintly. "You two need it. You've been traveling, caring for a sick child. You need to eat properly." Cade nodded, noting the thoughtful care in her tone. "I don't know how to thank you properly, for everything. The last few days, you saved us." "You don't have to thank me," Leela replied softly, plating the pancakes. "I just did what anyone should do. You were in trouble, and I could help. That's all that matters." Cade studied her as she worked, taking in the simple, honest strength of her movements, the quiet dignity in her posture, the gentle care she extended to both Evan and him. It struck him then that she embodied a rare kind of bravery, not the flash of gunfights or heroics, but the courage it took to live each day fully, to face hardship with grace, to offer kindness even when the world had given little in return. Evan, oblivious to the adult complexities surrounding him, dug into his pancakes with enthusiasm, giggling when Cade allowed him a small bit of syrup too much. Leela laughed quietly, and Cade found himself smiling, the sound feeling unfamiliar yet wonderful in its ease. The cabin, small and humble, had become a sanctuary, not just from the storm, but from the weariness of a world that had often demanded too much of each of them. After breakfast, Cade helped Lila tidy the cabin, carrying dishes to the sink and stacking firewood for the coming night. The work was quiet, a shared rhythm that built an unspoken connection. It was during these moments that Lila noticed the subtle details about Cade, the careful way he handled the fragile dishes, the precision with which he stacked the logs, the attention he paid to the smallest aspects of their environment. She had suspected as the days passed that he was more than he appeared. Now, seeing him move with such careful deliberation, she realized that her intuition had been correct. "What's your next stop?" Lila asked cautiously, trying not to sound too intrusive. Cade paused, looking out the window at the distant horizon. "We'll head west, toward town, to make sure Evan gets checked by a proper doctor. After that, I'm not sure. Things are complicated." His voice carried a mix of uncertainty and resolve. Leela nodded slowly, respecting the unspoken boundaries between them. She had opened her door to strangers out of necessity and compassion. But now she realized that bonds had formed. Bonds that might not last forever, but that would forever leave their mark on her life. As Evan played with a small wooden horse on the floor, Cade finally turned to Leela, his expression serious, yet soft. "I have to tell you, there's more about who I am, who we are, than I've said. You might not believe it, but it doesn't change the fact that you helped us when we needed it most. That matters more than anything else." Leela looked at him steadily. "I don't need to know everything about you," she replied gently. "I only need to know that you're genuine, that you care. And I can see that in everything you do." Cade's eyes softened, the faintest trace of relief crossing his face. He moved closer to the stove, where the fire cast a warm glow, and watched Leela fold the kitchen towels, her movements calm, deliberate, full of a quiet grace that seemed impossible to describe. In that moment, he understood something profound. Wealth, status, and past hardships mattered little compared to the simple acts of kindness and trust that had brought them together. The day stretched on, the snow slowly melting, revealing the vast expanse of prairie that seemed endless in all directions. Cade and Leela spent hours repairing small damages caused by the storm, fixing a section of fence, clearing debris, and tending to Evan's small garden patch, which had survived despite the harsh weather. Through these shared tasks, their understanding of one another deepened. Cade realized that Leela was not merely surviving. She was thriving in her own quiet way. Her resilience, resourcefulness, and unwavering compassion impressed him more than any title or wealth could. By late afternoon, Evan grew tired and nestled in Cade's lap once again, eyelids heavy with sleep. Leela knelt beside them, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from the boy's forehead. The moment was intimate, tender, and unspoken, a quiet recognition that something significant had occurred over the past days, The storm had forced them together, but it was their shared actions, care, and mutual respect that had truly bound them. Cade's voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. "I've traveled all over, seen all kinds of people, but you're different. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." Leela's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Perhaps that's because we're not looking for differences," she replied softly. "We're looking for humanity, for someone willing to care, to endure, to try. That's what matters most." The fire flickered, casting warm shadows across the cabin. Cade realized that the simple act of being welcomed into her home had changed him. It had reminded him of what truly mattered: family, compassion, and trust. Leela, too, felt the subtle shift. Her small cabin, once a place of isolation and survival, had become a space of connection, hope, and the promise of something more. As evening fell and the golden glow of the setting sun faded into soft twilight, Cade rose and approached Lila and Evan. He knelt beside them, careful not to disturb the sleeping boy, and took Lila's hand gently. "I don't know what comes next," he whispered, "but I know that leaving here wouldn't be right without saying thank you properly. For everything. For letting us stay. For trusting us. For everything." Leela felt warmth flood her chest. She squeezed his hand gently. Words unnecessary. The bond forged over a single night, strengthened by days of shared care and struggle, spoke louder than any thanks could. Outside, the prairie stretched infinitely, a reminder of the vast world beyond the cabin. Inside, warmth, trust, and quiet companionship enveloped them. Cade and Leela, strangers turned allies, had found something neither had expected: a connection forged by circumstance, but solidified by choice. The door, once closed against the harsh winds of the storm, remained open now, not just physically, but metaphorically. It symbolized the beginning of a story neither had anticipated, yet both were ready to embrace. It was the story of resilience, compassion, and the unexpected arrival of love in a small, snow-covered cabin on the prairie. As the last light of day faded, Cade held his son closer. Leela smiled softly, and all three of them understood that sometimes the simplest acts, offering shelter, a warm meal, a helping hand, could change lives in ways no one could predict. A single night of kindness had grown into days of trust, laughter, and hope. And the door, left open, promised that this story was far from over.